This is Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics. This lecture will summarize public economics, tie together some of the concepts that we've talked about so far, and also discuss a new topic, which is redistribution. Economists recognize that the government has several important roles. One of them is providing public goods, since the market cannot. Along the same lines, the government can manage common resources. Second, the government can establish and protect property rights. The economy would not function if, for example, a farmer did not know that the farmer would have the right to harvest and sell a crop that the farmer planted. Or, I, as a consumer, would not want to purchase a car if I knew that any other person could take my car, use it, damage it, do whatever the person wants with my car, and the government would not stop them from using and abusing my car. Again, I would not want to purchase anything if everyone else had the right to access it. Third, the government can intervene and regulate market failures. When, for example, a company grows too large and becomes uncompetitive in the market and takes advantage of the other side of the market, controls the price. Another example would be information, like the Food and Drug Administration helps ensure that consumers have information that a drug is effective and safe. Without that assurance, consumers would not want to purchase medications, even the ones that are good and effective, simply because they don't know which manufacturers to trust. And very importantly, the government can get involved when some type of behavior creates externalities. The government can control pollution and protect the common interest to have clean air against the desire of one manufacturer to pollute the air. A final role of the government is redistribution of resources. In fact, this is one of the very oldest roles of a central government, dating back thousands and thousands of years to ancient Egypt, when all the crops raised across the land would be sent to the capital, to the palace of the pharaoh, who would then divide up the harvest and send it back out to the people. So this was in some ways beneficial for the whole society because some parts of the country would have famines in some years, other parts of the country would have surpluses of crops. And rather than having an area with a famine starve in one year, and then a few years later have more food than they need while another place starves, the pharaohs would collect the food and then redivide it or redistribute it among the different parts of the country to ensure that everyone was fed. And so it served a common interest. Okay, I have not yet talked about redistribution, so that's going to be one of the topics in this lecture. Now, the government needs to pay for the public goods that it produces, so it needs to collect some revenue. And the name of revenue that the government collects, money that the government collects from people, is called taxes. There are several principles to designing a tax system. Probably a good starting point for designing a tax system is the benefits principle, which is the idea that the people who benefit from a public good are the ones who should pay for funding it. In other words, the public good should be funded with a type of tax paid by the people who use the public good. Perhaps a good example might be a national park that is funded with fees for entering the park. Another example would be the gasoline tax that's used to fund building and maintaining highways. That gasoline is purchased by the people who use the roads, and more or less, the more a person uses the roads, the more gas tax the person pays. So that is in some ways a tax that depends on the amount that a person benefits from the public good. We can maybe take this idea a little bit further and think about the government providing different services for fee in other areas. Maybe a starting point would be a public library. Now, by the way, a public library is a good example of a public good. Library books are kind of non-rival in consumption. At least after I've finished reading the book, someone else can read it. The book can be consumed or enjoyed by multiple people, and my reading the book does not use it up. Someone else can use it as well. So, I mean, that's the economist's explanation of what happens with a public library, but you get the idea as well, I'm sure, that it makes sense for the whole community to pool its money and buy one copy of the book instead of each individual person having to purchase the book if they want it. And then there may be some people who can't afford to buy the book. Regardless, using the community's money to buy the book saves everyone money, and it benefits some people who would not have been able to afford it on their own. Now, back to this benefits principle. I could imagine that public libraries, instead of allowing people to check out books for free, charge a fee to check out a book, for people to more or less rent the books from the public library. Then the public libraries could be funded by the people who use them. In some ways, that's neat because the public library could continue to purchase books as long as it anticipated there'd be an audience for the books. It could fund itself through revenues that it collects. Okay, maybe there are some reasons why we don't want publicly funded. Um, uh, I'm sorry. Maybe there are some reasons why we don't want public libraries funded with fees. But again, I think it's an idea worth exploring. So maybe the government could expand to fee for service in other areas. Imagine that when the fire department comes to put out a house fire, it uses a bunch of resources, it uses the time of its personnel, and rather than charging that bill to the entire community, it charges only the homeowner for the cost of extinguishing the burning home. That would be perhaps a more fair way to handle the cost of the fire department. Again, rather than burdening the entire community for for a service to one person. Okay, but there are some limitations to the benefit principle. One is, in some cases, it's hard to assign how much benefit each person, or it's hard to calculate how much benefit each person gets from some type of public good. Let's go back to that example where a house is extinguished or a house fire is extinguished. That actually provides benefit to all the neighbors because had the fire continued, it would have threatened the houses of the neighbors. So extinguishing the one burning house benefited others. But it'd be hard to calculate. I imagine it'd be hard to calculate that benefit, put a dollar amount on it. It might also be regarded as unfair that simply because a neighbor's house caught on fire, this person is charged for the cost of extinguishing the fire or the benefit they got because the fire was extinguished. Maybe that's not fair. Okay, similarly, public schools. Public schools, I imagine, could be run by fee for service instead of everyone in the community paying for the public school. By the way, public schools are usually funded with property taxes that are placed on the local community. So, that means that people who live in the local community who have kids certainly benefit from the public schools, from the public service. But also, at the same time, there's some people who have no kids attending public school who pay the cost of the public good but don't get the same benefit. But perhaps they do get some benefit. I think the justification for having public schools is that everyone in the community benefits from having an educated population. It makes the economy go smoother if everyone can read, write, do basic math, um, understands how government works. So having an education is of benefit to the whole community. But again, it might be hard to figure out how much everyone owes for that public good. Then a second thing is that maybe not everyone can afford to pay the bill. I mean, I imagine there are some things that simply everyone in the community gets equal value from. For example, clean air. Everyone benefits from clean air, and I imagine it's more or less the same value for everyone in the community. So, any costs of keeping the air clean would then need to be divided, at least according to the benefits principle, the cost would be divided equally among everyone in the community. But there's no guarantee that everyone would be able to pay their share. Um, you know, especially when we start thinking about additional services that the government provides, clean air, as well as clean water, as well as defense, as well as maybe policing. All of those things, if the costs were divided evenly among the population, there would be some people who couldn't pay their share. So that leads to the second principle of taxation, which is ability to pay. A good tax system should ensure that everyone has the ability to pay their share of the taxes. Okay, so for the most part, that means that the tax bill needs to be linked to one of three things. Either a person's income. So if we tax a person some fraction of their income, then of course they have enough income to pay the cost of their bill, or they have more than enough to pay the cost of their bill. A second is tax based on some type of resource. For example, property. If the tax is a fraction of what the person already owns, then of course the person has enough to cover the tax bill. It's a little bit tricky in some cases with property because property cannot easily be divided. So, for example, if my property tax bill is 1% of all the home value I have, I can't really sell off 1% of my home to cover the tax bill. But in principle, I do have enough resources to cover my share of the tax bill. A third thing is that taxes could be linked to consumption, either with a general sales tax or taxes on specific goods. And for the most part, we have both. Sales taxes are an important source of revenue for state and local governments. As I said, some goods like gasoline, alcohol, cars have their own specific taxes. And people will always be able to afford a tax on a consumption good. They don't necessarily need to purchase the item that is being taxed. So they could have a tax bill of zero if they have no money to spend. Just as a note, economists will point out that an income tax, a general income tax, is equivalent to a general consumption tax, at least a flat proportional tax. Again, that's a fixed percentage of a person's income, because all income will eventually go toward consumption. So taxing 10% of income could be done in the beginning, or the 10% could be taken off later at the time when the person makes purchases with that income. A tax can be described as proportional, which means a fixed percentage of income. So, for example, a flat 15% income tax is a proportional tax. A consumption tax of 15%, in other words, like a sales tax that's 15%, it would also be considered a proportional tax. A regressive tax is a smaller fraction of the income of wealthy people than of poor people. So if poor people pay 20% of their income in taxes and wealthy people pay 5% of their income in taxes, the tax would be described as regressive. A progressive tax is the reverse. A progressive tax is a smaller portion of the income of poor people than of rich people. So, if poor people pay 10% of their income in taxes and wealthy people pay 30% of their income in taxes, the tax system would be described as progressive. Okay, now why do we talk about these things? Perhaps if we're trying to design a fair tax system, a proportional tax is a good idea. It satisfies the ability to pay principle, and it's maybe fair as a percent of income, or maybe not. If it is the case that there are some necessities that people need to purchase, everyone needs to purchase them, then it means that the income left over after purchasing the necessities, which we call disposable income, is small for poor people than for wealthy people, smaller for poor people than for wealthy people. So a way to build that into a tax system is to design a tax to be progressive. Only a small portion of the income of poor people and a larger portion of the income of wealthy people. That does provide some, I guess, allowance for necessities, for the fact that the poor have less disposable income than the wealthy. And I think that most economists would agree that income tax systems should probably be progressive. A proportional income tax is simply not quite fair because the poor really can't afford to pay as large a share of their income as the wealthy. It's hard to justify a regressive income tax. It's hard to come up with a justification for a regressive income tax. One theory, however, is that when the wealthy spend their money, they create jobs for middle income workers. And when those middle income workers spend their money, they create jobs for low income workers. So there's this multiplier effect. That specific idea is sometimes described as trickle down economics, that the money would trickle down from the wealthy people to less wealthy people. But few economists really genuinely believe that's what happens. As a matter of fact, the wealthy tend to save a good portion of their income, and that money that gets saved, that gets hoarded, or does little to get passed on. Well, sorry, it does not get passed on, and so it has no multiplier to it. Okay, so I've talked about generally the role of the government. I've talked about taxes and principles for designing a tax system. The next topic is redistribution. As I said, one of the oldest roles of government has been redistribution of wealth. And I want to talk about some reasons why the government should redistribute, as well as reasons that the government should not redistribute wealth. Let me start with some of the arguments why the government should redistribute wealth. One is that an equitable society is a public good, essentially. That, for example, inequality leads to social unrest. As a matter of fact, uh, robbery, theft, is a transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor, I suppose. Um, Theft is motivated by inequality. So, reducing inequality would reduce the need for theft as well as remove some of the gains from theft. Okay, there's one argument. There are other reasons why equality is a public good. It just makes everyone happier. It uh, reduces other types of social unrest. A second argument is that inequality is the result of market failures. And there are two types of market failures. One are the failures that cause people to be unequal in the first place. Maybe they didn't have equal opportunities. Maybe there was some element of luck involved that resulted in unequal outcomes. So those are a type of market failure. Another type of market failure is what happens when society is inequitable. Maybe in one extreme, imagine that women are not allowed to work at all. That means that all productivity is done, or all production is done by men, and the economy produces only half as much. That's actually not good for the economy. Allowing women to enter the workforce increases the amount that's produced. That's good for the economy overall. And by extension, if we think of some of the inequities, even though women are allowed to work, maybe they don't have the same opportunities. Well, that is inefficient. It's like denying women certain parts of the economy or denying them certain types of work. The economy can produce more if we allow qualified women to enter those jobs. A third argument for redistribution is based on a philosophy called utilitarianism. The idea of utilitarianism is that the government should maximize happiness in society. Sometimes that's described as creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The utilitarian argument in favor of redistribution is essentially that money has more value to poor people than it does to wealthy. We've probably all seen a cartoon image of a millionaire or billionaire lighting a cigar with $100 bill. This conveys the idea that something that would be valuable to the common person is nothing to that millionaire. The person could burn it up and never notice. Okay, so that's the idea that money has more value to poor people than to the wealthy. Here's a variation on that idea. Think of someone fantastically wealthy like Jeff Bezos. If we were to take $1 million from Jeff Bezos, it would never impact his life in any way whatsoever. He will always have more money than he ever knows what to do with. But if we gave that $1 million to poor people, gave $1,000 to 1,000 needy families, it would bring real meaning and real financial relief to their lives. So again, something that has no value to the billionaire can bring a lot of happiness to other people. Yet another argument is essentially one of social justice, and I like an idea that comes from the philosopher John Rawls. Rawls says that if we want to have a just society, we need to think of policies we would enact as if we did not know who we are in society. He talks about an original position from behind the veil of ignorance. Imagine that you are not yet born. And when you're born, you could be anyone in society. You could be the rich kid, you could be the poor kid, you could be born male, you could be born female, you could be born of any skin color, race, ethnicity. What types of policies would you want to enact? And would you, for example, want more equality in society? And Rawls says, from behind of from behind the veil of ignorance, yes, we would want more equality. The idea is built on utilitarianism, that money has more value to poor people than to wealthy people. So imagine again that you're not yet born. You have a 50-50 chance of being born fantastically wealthy, like Jeff Bezos, or being born the person who grows up dirt poor. Would you want, in that case, to have a law that redistributes money from the wealthy person to the poor person? And if money has less value for wealthy people than for poor people, you would say, yes, yes, I do want that type of redistribution. So Rawls would say it's the socially just thing to do. Rawls' idea of social justice can be applied in other areas as well. Now let me present some of the arguments why the government should not redistribute wealth. The first is a matter of incentives. If income is taxed, it removes some of the motivation for people to work, and that is harmful to society overall. As a matter of fact, all of economics is generated by people striving to be better, and inequality is necessary for that. A second is that people are entitled to their property. Even in cases where people did not earn the property, it's immoral for the government to take it away from them. Sometimes people even have unfair advantages in the labor market, in life, because of gender or skin color or race, ethnicity, other things about their backgrounds that they did nothing to deserve. And yet, we could make the argument that it remains their property, even if there's no justification why they had it in the first place. It remains their property, and it's immoral to take their property from them. So, here's an example along those lines to try to give you that perspective.